Welcome to our discussion on the Naglieri General Ability Tests. I'll be your moderator for this Q&A, and I'm excited to introduce the authors of the Naglieri General Ability Tests, Dr. Jack Naglieri, Dr. Dina Brulles, and Dr. Kimberly Lansdowne. These three separate tests measure general intellectual ability using verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative content. The main goal of these tests is to ensure that identification of all gifted students, regardless of their race, ethnicity, educational opportunities, and language, can gain access to gifted and talented education. In this video, we will have the opportunity to hear from each of the authors. Would you please introduce yourselves? Dr. Naglieri, you can begin.
Thank you, Antonia. Hi, I'm Jack Naglieri. I have been building tests for probably, about 40 years now, and really excited to be able to share ideas about those tests with my two co-authors here today.
Hi, I'm Dina Brulles, and I am the Director of Gifted Education for a fairly large school district in Phoenix, Arizona, Paradise Valley Unified School District. I'm also the Gifted Program Coordinator for the Master's Program in Gifted Education at Arizona State University. And I have been using Dr. Naglieri's test for decades, and we're excited to be here today to talk about some new tests coming out.
Hi, my name is Kim Lansdowne. I am the Executive Director of the Herberger Young Scholars Academy, which is a specialized school located on Arizona State University campus. I am also on the faculty of Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, and I really specialize in testing and measurement in my teaching. I have extensive experience too with administering all kinds of different cognitive abilities assessments. And so this is just a passion that we all share, is to find those kids, those smart kids that are out there. I'm glad to be here.
Great, thank you all so much for those introductions. So how did everyone get interested in equitable assessment and especially the identification of gifted students?
Dina and I have been professional colleagues for, Dina, over 20 years now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when we first met, we were on the Arizona Association of Gifted Children, the board for the state of Arizona, and equitable identification was at that point very much talked about and very much an issue more than 2 decades ago. And there have been a lot of people that have put a lot of time and energy and research into this problem, but it still exists. And there have been small changes over the past few decades, but we really can do more. Dina and I traveled together to Washington to attend SANG, Supporting the Emotional Needs of the Gifted conference. And while we were there, we went in to listen to Dr. Jack Naglieri talk about the assessments that he was introducing at that time. And Dina and I started using those in our respective school districts. And so we have known each other for a long time and really been working towards this together.
When I started getting interested in this topic was because I was working as a gifted coordinator in a Title I district and was about 80% Hispanic. And our gifted population was 80% white. And we thought, there's something wrong here. We need to figure out how we can make this more equitable on the identification aspect. So at that time, I started using the NGAT, and I also started cluster grouping these students together. And within 5 or 6 years, those numbers completely reversed, where our gifted population was 80% Hispanic. We didn't identify fewer white students, but we greatly increased our ability to identify by using those tools, training teachers, and our capacity to serve by bringing in students that had high potential. So skip about 10 years, and then I moved to my current school district in Paradise Valley, and I realized that we were doing a really good job identifying and serving white kids. So I started on this whole track again to reverse some of that and to be more inclusive. I also work with districts all over the country by interacting with those folks around the country, the coordinators, I realized we are all dealing with the same issues. But I see a lot of really extraordinary efforts out there, coordinators in certain schools using the different tests, using local norms and building norms, and they're trying to make headway. And I think our work is going to help propel some of that.
In 1979, I went to Arizona, northern Arizona, actually, for Flagstaff to start working as a university professor in school psychology. When I was there, I learned about how the Native American students were being evaluated. And I was very displeased to see my colleagues in psychology administering intelligence tests to Navajo students who didn't have the knowledge of English and is not as much knowledge in general, and getting low scores on that test. And then the psychologist would interpret those scores as if they were valid. And I felt they were totally invalid because the measurement of intelligence was confounded by the knowledge in general and the knowledge of English in particular. So in 1982, I published my first research paper arguing that the WISC did not measure verbal intelligence for Native American Navajos. That was my first of many papers on this topic. I have repeatedly, decade after decade, argued that we need to measure intelligence in a way that calibrates how well a child can think in a way that's not confounded by how much they know. When I published my Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, actually first edition of that was called Matrix Analogies Test in 1985. Even then, in 1985, I explicitly said that this kind of a test could fairly identify gifted children because it's not influenced by what they know. It's a reflection of how well the student can think. And over the years, I've published many papers, research papers, that show that the nonverbal method worked. But people said to me, what about the verbal and the quantitative? And that really led me to start to think about how could we make a verbal and quantitative test that would be workable for everyone. And I had the great fortune of having these discussions with Kim and Dina, and we wrote our first book together, and our conversations over the years led us closer and closer to the ability to come up with solutions, which we'll talk about.
So this has clearly been an issue for a very long time that you all have seen. And so what does it mean to achieve equitable identification of gifted students to each of you?
I guess a goal for a lot of the schools is that their gifted population reflects their student population. It's rarely the case unless we do something differently. And I've noticed over the years that we keep doing the same thing and keep getting the same results, even though we're striving to correct that. And after decades of watching these students take the test, especially our former ELL students, students of diverse cultures, those that live in poverty, that do not have access to resources, materials, experience. They haven't had some of these opportunities to learn that other students that we are doing a great job identifying maybe have had. So when we dissect that, we take it apart and we're like, what is the obstacle here? And a lot of it is just in the directions, in the language that we are using to administer the test, to give the directions, to show the children how they're supposed to proceed through taking these tests. Sometimes they just don't even understand that completely in order to be able to follow those directions. But then when we get to the test items that are laden with a lot of English language, that a lot of the knowledge that Jack was referring to, once again, we've created obstacles in our processes that are keeping these students not out of our programs, but also out of the recognition that they have high ability and they have potential to learn. And those are the kids that concern me the most, those really smart kids who have not acknowledged who haven't had some of those opportunities. So our goal with these tests is to remove some of those barriers that were keeping them from demonstrating some of that potential that they have.
High achievement does not necessarily mean that a student is gifted. In the past, in my position as a school district coordinator, we would very often have kids that are the high achieving kids that are being identified for gifted programs. And then those high achieving kids are really, yes, will they benefit from the gifted program? Yes, they will, but they are not necessarily the kids who need that program and that service. And so for some school districts, my school district, we were identifying students, and our FTE, or employment, who we hired to go into those schools, was based on the number of students that were identified. So our wealthy, high achieving schools would have full-time gifted specialists and full-time services and a lot of resources. And our Title I schools that we were not having a lot of success identifying students had part-time and sometimes not even enough gifted identified students to have any teacher in the building. And so it's the kids that need those kinds of resources are not the students that are receiving them when we are basing employment on the number of kids that are identified. And so that was always such a big issue to me in a school district that had very diverse levels of socioeconomic status. It was always the wealthier schools honestly got wealthier in this identification. But that was something that was really an issue for us in the district that I was in.
When I think about what equity means, everything that Dina and Kim described certainly applies. And I would just add that the key ingredient is the information that we get when we're trying to make a decision, should the student be in a gifted program or not. And that's complicated in and of itself because of the many different components of that decision-making process. But one of the key elements is an ability test that is used. And the simplest explanation of how equity can be detected with a test is if all children, regardless of their gender or their race, their ethnicity, whether they're English language learner or not, whether they've been disadvantaged or not, that they all have an equal opportunity to answer the questions. And we detect that mathematically by looking at the scores that different groups of children obtain. And as I mentioned, on a traditional IQ test, these groups differ. And that's lack of equity. And so what we wanted, and as you'll see, what we achieved were tests that don't yield big differences. And once you have that kind of information, then equity is more feasible, more possible.
So let's discuss the 3 different tests included in the Naglieri General Ability Tests. Dina, can you start with the verbal test?
Long ago when Jack started, Dr. Naglieri was saying, there's got to be a way to measure verbal ability regardless of the language that the student speaks, without language. And we kind of percolated over that for a few years. And Jack came to us and said, okay, I've got an idea. And I'll just speak to the verbal part. A lot of it was based on Alexandria Luria's language cognition. He is a psychologist who specialized in this area. And what we're doing in this test, it's a verbal test that has no language, that has no words. So regardless of the language that the child speaks, they can use their conceptual understanding of language, how language is developed conceptually. Even though we all speak a different language, we are all, there's no such thing as a nonverbal person. We think with language. So basically the test items each involve a concept that's depicted through pictures. And what the student will have to do is look at those pictures and find what's common in them and how they relate to each other. And they start off, some of them very simple to begin with, and they become very complex. MHS connected with experts in culture and linguistics to make sure that the items that we're using were not biased against certain cultures. So for example, if we're looking at animals, there's certain animals that we couldn't use because they would be insulting to a certain culture, or certain foods or certain experiences that we could depict through a picture. So what the students will have to do is think about what concept those items are representing, and they'll do that regardless of the language that they speak, because they're thinking about how they think about those, relate to those. This test is not the verbal, I can speak to especially, it's not measuring anything that they will have learned in school or read in a book, but rather how they think conceptually. So it's measuring their thinking processes as opposed to what they may have learned.
Dr. Naglieri, would you like to explain about the nonverbal section of the test?
Sure. So the nonverbal portion of the tests is one that's made by using diagrams and shapes and colors and rotations and things like that. The student needs to understand the relationships of all these shapes to arrive at the answer. And it's very much like the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, which I published previously. And it has a funny title, nonverbal. It's kind of like not the greatest definition, actually, because it tells you what it isn't. It doesn't tell you what it is. But it is a measure of general ability. And by that, what I mean is a foundational ability that allows you to solve many kinds of problems, whether they are verbal or so-called nonverbal or quantitative. It doesn't really matter. It's this foundation ability that is being measured. We call it general ability. And we can measure it using diagrams, or as Dina's already described, using words. And as Kim will describe next, in the quantitative.
I think everybody is familiar with the phrase that math is a universal language. And the reason that people say that is because math is really the same all over the world. And regardless of the language that goes along with, math helps people learn and communicate. And so one of the big challenges with other tests that I have administered in order to determine reasoning ability, especially in math, is the enormous amount of language that's necessary in the directions of these assessments. And so when we were developing the quantitative portion of this, the questions are presented with numbers and shapes, and the students are asked to identify the pattern. So the relationships, the pattern, the sequences among numbers and symbols determine the reasoning ability of the student that's taking it. The directions are very minimal. I think that we'll probably talk about that later. But the quantitative reasoning piece of it does not involve any language. We are able to do this without confounding it with a lengthy amount of directions. The tests require students to examine relationships, patterns, sequences among numbers and symbols. And it's just basic math. It's basic math concepts. There isn't really anything complicated. There are no math word problems that have to be solved. And again, the questions can be solved regardless of the language that's spoken by the students that are taking it.
So how were these tests developed?
So we started off with a couple of goals, which I think are apparent. We wanted to reduce the amount of knowledge required. We wanted to do something about the verbal instructions. Most tests have really lengthy verbal instructions, and obviously that's an obstacle. So what we did was we created animated video that introduces each of the three types, the three tests, with the three types of content. So the student watches a little avatar, move the mouse, and arrive at the right answer, and navigate to the next question. The other thing that we do, we don't require the student to speak. So in a typical individually administered intelligence test, student needs to speak. And the more you speak, the more likely you're going to get a higher score. In this case, it's multiple choice, so that's not necessary.
One of the benefits of working in a school district is that we have access to these kids. So as we're developing the verbal items, and we developed several hundred of them, I would go into the schools and we would just show the items to the kids and just listen to them as they talk through it. And so we did this basically from preschool through middle school. And then when we started piloting the test, I also went in and administered the test with different groups of students, gifted and general ed. But afterward, I would collect them and we would just go through the test items and just listen to them, their conversations. And they were super excited about it. The discussions that they had was, and you would see somebody smirking because they saw the answer in a different way. So it was just fun to see that how appealing the items were to the students and how excited they were to actually take the test. And sometimes they didn't want to stop or they didn't want to let go of an item, and because then they had these conversations later of trying to decide whose answer was best. And so from those experiences, I realized that this was going to be something that was going to be very attractive to them and engaging, and because it's challenging and it's a different way to take a test.
I happen to work in a school that has all highly and profoundly gifted kids that go here every day. And so, like Dina said, it was really exciting to be able to take the test items and to repeat what Dina said, there were several hundred that were developed over the course of the time frame that we were doing this. So it was really fun to be able to take them and have the kids take a look at them. We all worked very separately on these test items. We didn't collaborate. The three of us did not. Dina worked on verbal, Jack worked on nonverbal, I worked on quantitative. And I know, Jack, you collaborated with both Dina and me. But I did not see Dina's items until they were far, far developed. And to sit and actually go through the verbal items, it was really an experience for me. And it was fun to actually go through and talk about each and every one of those concepts. And so it's enjoyable. The kids enjoy taking these. They don't seem like test items. They seem like puzzles and challenges, and the kids are really engaged. It doesn't feel like a test. It doesn't seem like a test. It's just kids solving problems that they have not seen before. I think it's important to note that it wasn't Dina, Jack, and me sitting around coming up with these items. I know that I had a tremendous amount of support from PhD research scientists at MHS, that they were with us all along the way and supporting us and making suggestions. And there's just so much research that went into this very, very lengthy process. This was not a quick process at all. And we had a lot of people that do this all day, every day, helping us along the way.
So what are some of the innovative aspects of these three tests?
I think the most innovative is the fact that we have taken a traditional approach and improved on it dramatically by allowing students to be evaluated within a verbal context, a nonverbal context, and a quantitative context. But the kinds of questions that we have can be solved regardless of the background of the student. I think that's really a key. Of course, the animated instructions, no one does that. And just the configuration and the way in which we have prepared these items, they're familiar, but at the same time, they're different. And the difference is what really matters the most in terms of their effectiveness as equitable measures of ability.
I think another innovative aspect is that usually when we think about verbal tests, we're thinking language and words. Quantitative, we're thinking like all of the language that goes into solving some of these problems. So with these tests, we really want to emphasize if it's really measuring thinking, not knowledge, we have to look at those test items and say, it's the construct of the test item that makes it verbal, quantitative, or nonverbal. It's not a way of thinking separately. It's all going to the same end result, which Jack had mentioned, general ability. So if we can remove language out there, I think it further emphasizes that point that it is, these are tests that are measuring thinking, not knowledge, if when you look at it, the test items themselves without the language. So that's an innovative aspect of that. It's also a way of changing the way we're thinking about these ability tests, as opposed to removing that, getting away from some of the historically followed procedures that we use. Verbal, you're going to go into an honors reading. Quantitative, you're going to go into an honors math class, that's such a thing. The items really show us how we use that information in whatever we're doing. We're making inferences, we're drawing conclusions, we're making connections between ideas and concepts and seeing those relationships and patterns. And you'll see this is repeated in all of our language as we've described our tests, the verbal, the quantitative, or the nonverbal. So it's the underlying way of the thought processes that we're measuring the ability, as opposed to discrete, different abilities that traditionally people would associate with a verbal, quantitative, or nonverbal test.
We very traditionally have kids that have scored high in verbal, like you said, go into an honors language arts program, and a student that scores high in the quantitative goes into an advanced maths. So what are you saying? Then once they're identified on our assessment, now what? What do you do with them?
Well, I think this is part of the problem, because traditionally we have a gifted program, and then we cherry pick kids that will do well in that program. We look for kids who are going to be successful, where we want to take the opposite approach. We want to look for kids who are really smart, and then modify our existing services, our programs, in a way that we can include them, that we can help them develop that potential regardless of which area it is. So I like to lose sight, basically, of the area of identification as a gifted coordinator. I say these kids have high ability. I'm going to group them together. I'm going to give them some challenges, some more complex instruction that they wouldn't have gotten in a regular general education class, and see where those strengths lie, and then help develop those strengths as they continue with that. But first they need to be together with other smart kids. So we need to group these kids together because they challenge each other, and with a teacher who has some training and understanding of how these kids think, how they learn. And then we can build on those areas of academic strengths or build those areas that they need building in some of the academics. But first of all comes the recognition that they're smart, and it crosses over to whatever content they're learning in school.
So we discussed a little bit about how the Naglieri General Ability Tests are administered, but could you go into more detail about that?
So the verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative tests, these are three separate tests, are all administered in the same way. They're typically going to be group administered. They could be individually administered. And initially, it will be available as an online administration format. We will have a paper version after that. The goal of efficient identification of all gifted children really demands universal assessment, which means everyone needs to be tested. And it's really best to do that in a group environment. And so that's how we expect the tests are going to be used the most, and certainly initially online.
When we keep talking about perpetuating the underrepresentation, I think it's a part of that is just because we have this artificial cutoff that we decide you're gifted, you're not. And that's going to look different in whatever school you're in, whatever area, part of the city, but part of the district. So what I have been doing in both of the districts I've been a coordinator in the last 20 years is I really do use building norms. And that can expand on this, but that's just a subset basically of local norms. What I want to do is look at the local population and see which kids in that school are going to benefit most from receiving some of this attention, some of the services and the challenge level. So who's participating in gifted services in one school might look very different who is participating in gifted services at another school. So that's why it's so very important to look at who's going to benefit from services. And that's the approach that that we're taking with this test. And we're going to guide users, schools, through how to use the test results to calculate which students might you best serve based on the results of the sample of the students that take that test and you're on site or at a certain grade level.
If we could go back and, wave our magic wand over all of those schools and be able to look at each one individually. So we would, after administering the assessment, be able to really rank order those students and determine within each building. It could be within the district, within the building. It could be within a school, and it could even be within a grade level, that you are looking at the students that are most different than the group that you have administered the assessment to. So those are the students within that either district, building, grade level, even a group that really do need those services that are very different than what the traditional, the general education services that are being provided. So that's when we talk about using local norms, you would be able to then make that so much more equitable, especially in districts. And I think probably a lot of districts have schools that are very different in their socioeconomic status. And so that just levels the playing field for these kids that really do need something different than just the general education program.
Is there data or evidence that your goal of equitable assessment can be achieved?
Actually, there is excellent evidence that we can achieve equitable assessment using these three tests. And this evidence is part of an initial research study conducted by the publisher, MHS. And what they did was collect 3 samples. One group of people got each of the 3 tests. The total sample size across all of these studies was a little more than 8,000 people, grades K to 12, and each sample nicely represented the US population. And what they found was that there were very small gender differences, very small differences by race, very small differences by ethnicity, and again, very small differences across parental education levels. So because we have 3 studies, we essentially replicated our findings 3 times. And to get the same result with huge samples of 3 tests with different content, but they're each designed to measure the same concept of general ability, it's an extraordinarily powerful study that supports our initial goal, which was to devise tests that would be equitable. And I think this evidence is so very powerful, saying that we achieved that goal.
Thank you all so much for your time and this wonderful discussion. What's your hope for the future of equitable assessment?
I think it's really to recognize the kids that have not been recognized. It's got to be hard to know and to self-identify as being smart and just have not one single person recognize that in you. That's got to be a pretty tough place to be. So my goal would be recognition of students that really are smart.
In addition to that, one of my goals would be to help others try to disassociate achievement from the ability so that we can better identify those students that are smart, but maybe just haven't developed those skills through no fault of their own, just lack of resources or opportunities. So I'm hoping that others will recognize this as well, that we have some smart kids out there that just focusing on some of that potential and minimizing the achievement, we can get them into our programs and start building on that potential so that achievement does follow.
Our history in psychology has misled us to think that people are different when that difference is a reflection of the tools that we used to measure those people in the first place. So I hope that by showing the evidence that there are a lot of really smart children who've been alienated and disenfranchised by expectations. And as we continue to show in our research just how similar people really are, regardless of what they look like, that we can ultimately make a change for the individuals and a change for this field of gifted education, which we all feel so passionately about.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all again so much for this great discussion that we had today. And thanks to everyone who's watching. For more information about the Naglieri General Ability Test, please visit naglierigifted.tests.com.